Hi, welcome back to Philosophy 101, Morals and Society from Honolulu Community College. I am Chris Ann Moore. Tonight we're going to do Program 17, the Renaissance, Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. As we saw 2 episodes ago in our episode 15 on Thomas Aquinas, that Thomas Aquinas had succeeded in accomplishing an amazing feat. Thomas Aquinas had gotten the church to accept reason and observation as methods of knowing. He had gotten the church to accept Aristotle's knowledge and, more importantly, to accept Aristotle's methods. Philosophy was once again reintroduced into the West. And Aquinas set about applying reason and observation of nature to determining the truth, or actually proving the truth of church doctrine. And in the process, he created his Summa Theologica, volumes of work, which is a massive intellectual synthesis showing that reason and observation of nature confirmed Christian doctrine. In the process, he created proofs for the existence of God. He attempted to answer the question, if God is good, why do evil and suffering exist? And he created one of the most influential ethical theories in the West. Interestingly, however, although Aquinas' theory still has tremendous influence, was eventually adopted by the church and still underlies many of our cultural notions today, in the period immediately following Aquinas' death, Aquinas' methods were rejected once again. You see, exactly what the church had thought would happen once reason was reintroduced did happen. Once human beings begin to reason, they begin to question authority, they begin to question doctrine, and they begin to come up with their own ideas. This is exactly what the church had feared. And thus, in the wake of Aquinas' Aristotelian synthesis, there was an anti-Aristotelian reaction. There was a reaction against rationalism. There was a new anti-rationalism. And in fact, the great philosophers who followed Aquinas in the medieval period, John Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, rejected rationalism as a way of knowing the will of God, or God's commands, or for that matter, the good. William of Ockham lived from 1280 to 1349, John Scotus around the years 1266, and both of them disagreed that God's will, or the good, could be revealed by reason and observation. Now, Aristotle had become extremely important in the universities of the medieval period, but the scholastic philosophy that had developed in the medieval period and the philosophy that was carried out after the rediscovery of Aristotle was extremely logical, extremely analytic, extremely textually based. And for many, it appeared extremely dry. So this new anti-rationalistic sentiment and also this rejection of the logical analysis of Aristotle, which seemed very dry, led to this new anti-rationalism. Because of that, once again, ethics will be the province of the church alone. In fact, there will not be another major ethical theory until the 18th century. So we're talking some 500 years until once again ethics becomes the province of philosophy. So what I want to do in this episode is cover a short, really a brief historical summary of some of those events that occurred from right after Aquinas' death until really the rebirth of philosophy in the mid-17th century, and then the major ethical theories that would be a result of that rebirth in the 18th century. But we can't just skip 500 years, so we have to look at what happened. You see, Aquinas' work was extraordinarily ambitious. Some people have actually created a metaphor of Aquinas' work with the great Gothic cathedrals that were being built around the same period in the high Middle Ages. You see, the great Gothic cathedrals had these spires that reached to the heavens. And right about the time that Thomas was creating his Sume, they were building the largest Gothic cathedral of all time. In fact, it had a spire that reached higher than any spire had ever reached before. And guess what happened? Yes, exactly. The spire fell. It was toppled by its own reach. And in a sense, there are those who say the same thing of Thomas's Sume, that it had overreached its bounds, and the reaction was therefore a new anti-rationalism. You see, anti-rationalism is basically the notion that God's omnipotence is not limited by rationality. Anti-rationalism, God's omnipotence is not limited by rationality. What does this mean? Well, you see, Socrates had believed that we did not need God's commands to know what was good. That in fact, determining divine command was extraordinarily difficult, and therefore another method was necessary to determine the good. And Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the Greek rationalistic tradition had really determined that human reason, or human reason coupled with observation, could determine the good, because the good would be rational. Aquinas adopted, really, and modified this idea. Aquinas believed that both revelation and rationality were sources of knowledge, revelation actually being superior to rationality. But Aquinas certainly believed that we could determine God's laws through reason, that God's laws were indeed rational laws, that the laws of nature were indeed rational and logical, and therefore could be perceived and known by human reason and human rationality. However, the philosophers that followed Aquinas, and the position of the church itself, is that God is not limited by logic. God is not limited by reason. God is not limited by rationality. Therefore, human reason cannot be used to determine God's laws, to know God's will, or to predict what God's purpose might be. We cannot know God's purposes using human reason because God is not necessarily rational. God supersedes all rationality. This vision, therefore, leaves the only way to know the good, divine revelation. And of course, in the late medieval period, that was in the hands of the church authorities alone. Ethics, the good, could only be known by divine revelation. Reason and observation as methods for knowing ethics was completely rejected once again. This anti-rationalism was further supported by a new mystical movement that had swept through Europe shortly after Aquinas' death. This mystical movement had many adherents and many leaders, one of the most famous of which is Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart lived from 1260 to 1327 AD. And Meister Eckhart and others sought not to understand God by reason, but instead to achieve mystical union with God, or to have a mystical experience, a personal experience of God. And Eckhart and others said that, in fact, reason, the mind, gets in the way of achieving such an experience. This is really the meditative mystical tradition within the church, and the meditative mystical tradition seeks not to understand God with the mind, but to know God through experience, through a joyful, ecstatic, mystical union with God. And that this joyful, ecstatic, mystical union is prevented by the reasoning mind. This is not that different from what we discussed episodes ago with Lao Tzu and Buddha. Those who seek to have this mystical, ecstatic experience often reject the reasoning mind as an obstacle to that experience. So, because of this new anti-rationalism that was adopted by the philosophers, adopted by the church, and then adopted by the thousands who now joined mystical movements, the attempt to develop a philosophical ethic was ended. And once again, ethics, and actually all existential questions, all questions about the meaning and purpose of existence and what one ought to do, all of the questions that philosophy also deals with are once again in the hands of the church. But something very interesting happens. Although existential questions remain the province of the church, science, which is really the Aristotelian legacy in some ways, continues. However, Aristotelian science had been hampered by Aristotle's own notions that everything had a purpose. Because really, Aristotle, in a sense, projected his concepts of purpose on nature, which prevented him sometimes from seeing the facts. Aristotelian proto-science contains a lot of mistakes for that reason. But once one can observe the facts, freed of Aristotelian notions, science can develop in more productive directions. So in one of the great contradictions of history, the rejection of Aristotle, the anti-rationalism applied to existential questions, and the rejection of Aristotle's purpose and meaning imposed on life allowed science to move forward unhampered by Aristotle's own assumptions. This really set the stage for the next great period in Western history, which is the Renaissance. The Renaissance is actually dated from the death of William of Ockham, although it should be obvious that movements don't start in 1 year. Huge errors don't happen in 1 year, but it does seem that in the year of 1349, which is William of Ockham's death, these forces that are going to create the Renaissance converge. And these forces will lead to a whole new consciousness, a whole new way of thinking that will be called the Renaissance. And the Renaissance really is the rebirth of humanism. The Renaissance, which is approximately from 1350 to 1650, Renaissance really means the rebirth. Renaissance means rebirth. And here the rebirth that is referred to is the rebirth of humanism. What do we mean by humanism? Well, a rebirth of interest in the human mind, in human creativity, in the development of human potential, and a belief actually in the possibilities of human genius. This is what marks the Renaissance. You see, in the medieval period, life was seen as a vale of tears. This world was just something to be passed through on the road to salvation or damnation. And actually, human beings themselves were seen to have very little ability to even participate in that. Humans were seen as sinful and flawed and hampered by their own sinful nature. Their salvation could only be achieved through faith or the sacraments of the church. There was little belief in human potential and creativity and imagination or genius, for that matter. Now, of course, the medieval period had its beauty. Every life was endowed with definite meaning and purpose. And in fact, the entire cosmos was seen to be fighting over the destiny of your soul. And life, in a sense, was magically imbued with forces that were fighting out this purpose to achieve salvation or damnation. But the human being, him or herself, was seen as really incapable of achieving salvation on their own. If one looks at the art of the Middle Ages, there's very little scenes of nature. It's a cruel world, a test, really, to be passed through. And figures of the human body are extremely two-dimensional and very ethereal and saint-like. In the Renaissance, we will see the development of a whole nother kind of art. What had really, one of the forces that really gave birth to this new consciousness was the recovery of the remainder of Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy and literature. Greek philosophy and literature, Roman philosophy and literature came into the West. Aristotle had led the way, but eventually Plato was rediscovered. In fact, 40 of Plato's dialogues were eventually rediscovered, as well as other Greek writers and as well as other Roman writers. And in the wake of this anti-Aristotelian sentiment, rather than interest in Plato's critical philosophy, what really drew people's interest was Plato's literary style. The art in Plato's own writing. See, the Renaissance is really defined by this flourishing of art, of literature, of letters, as well as some essential scientific discoveries. It is science and art which are at the basis of the Renaissance. And really it begins in just a few small city-states in northern Italy and eventually spreads throughout Europe. And at the center of this movement is this idea that the human person has tremendous capacity for creation, and that the world, the natural world, is in fact a joyful mirror of God's creation. In this rebirth of humanism, there is not a rejection of God as creator, but there is a rejection of a focus on transcendence alone. It is now to be understood that God can be celebrated in nature, and the human being is to be celebrated as made in God's image. And now the art of the Renaissance, rather than these ethereal, two-dimensional figures, we have these muscled, sensuous, even sexy figures. We have lush, natural scenes which are absolutely incredibly beautiful, as well as religious scenes. It was, in a sense, the rediscovery of philosophy and the rebirth of science that led to this new celebration of life. But there were other factors as well, and in fact, a huge factor contributing to the Renaissance was actually a confrontation with death. Early in the 14th century, the Black Plague had infested Europe, really ravaged Europe. It was a horrible disease, and its death seemed inescapable, unstoppable. Over 1/3 the population of Europe would be infected by the Black Plague and would die. In fact, people died so quickly that there weren't enough people left to bury the dead. Cities filled with rotting corpses and then rats. It's hard to imagine the level of the horror of the Black Plague. And in a sense, this confrontation with death is part of what led to the celebration of life, oddly enough, in the Renaissance. But this confrontation with death led to something else important as well. You see, the entire medieval worldview was shook by this, because it became obvious, as Europe was ravaged by death, that the pious and the good fell as quickly and horribly as the evil and the wicked. Those ideas that the medieval mind had had such faith in were shook, were challenged. And something else happened as well. People began to question the authority of the church and began to question the hierarchy of the church, the ecclesiastics, because they too fell horribly. And in this questioning, something began to be revealed, which is, as the church had become more and more politically powerful, her hierarchy had become more and more corrupt. And as people began to question the church, that corruption became inescapably obvious. You see, the popes, the bishops, the cardinals, even the priests and the monks had tremendous political power, and they also quite often had tremendous wealth. They lived extraordinarily luxurious lives. They were also constantly involved in warfare and political intrigue. They also, many of them, had mistresses and illegitimate children, which was well known to everyone. As time went by, it seemed that the leaders of the church have moved farther and farther and farther away from what they taught was in the Holy Bible, from what the masses of the pious faithful actually believed were the teachings of Jesus. And this new humanistic art of the Renaissance, a great deal of it was funded by the church hierarchy. And that was very costly. So where was the church getting all of this money? Well, one of the ways the church lined its coffers was through the practice of indulgences. Earlier in the late Middle Ages, the church had invented purgatory. Purgatory is not mentioned in the Bible. Purgatory was said to be a place where individuals who had died or babies who had not been baptized would go to atone for their sins. You see, it was believed by the church in the Middle Ages that confession of sins was not enough to receive forgiveness. Often today, confession is considered sufficient to receive forgiveness from the church. But in the Middle Ages, one needed to confess one's sins, but one also had to atone for one's sins. One had to do good works. But what happens if you've confessed your sins, but you haven't done a sufficient number of good works to atone for your sins? Does that mean you're going to be damned for all time? And babies who are not baptized. Are babies who are not baptized damned for all time, as the church teachings would seem to say? You see, these seem to be grotesquely unfair doctrines. In a sense, purgatory was invented to accommodate for the unfairness. Now, instead of going to hell, those who had not atoned sufficiently, or the unbaptized babies, could go to purgatory, where they could do good works or be prayed out of purgatory and eventually reach heaven. Well, the church fathers figured out that the church, of course, has vast stores of good works because the church performs enormous numbers of good works. And so the church thought, well, they could sell their good works to others. And these indulgences would mean that if you bought the church's good works, you wouldn't have to atone for your own sins. The church had atoned for your sins. So therefore, one could buy atonement for one's sins. One could buy it for oneself. One could buy it for one's family. You could even buy atonement for sins you were planning to commit in the future. Well, this seemed like an obviously corrupt practice to some. And so the political power, the mistresses, the illegitimate children, the selling of indulgences, the financing of this incredibly humanistic sexual art, the political intrigue, the assassinations, and then it all came to a head when actually, at one point, there were two popes. There was a pope in France, in Avignon, and a pope in Rome, each claiming to be the pope. This was from 1378 to 1415. Once there were two popes, it really became doubtful to the masses of followers that the church really was the sole line to God, that the church was really holy, that the church really was endowed by God with the souls of all the faithful to ensure salvation. And this led to the next great movement, which would be finally the breaking of the monolithic control of the church over the Western mind. It didn't happen until 1517. The Protestant Reformation, the breaking away of other Christian churches from the Catholic Church. But the Protestant Reformation was set up, really, first there was the corruption of the church, this re-interest in humanism and even individualism in art and science. And then came the most important invention of the time, and perhaps the most important invention of all time, the printing press. The printing press was invented in 1447. And the printing press would have an enormous impact. Just think of it. Books are suddenly available. And they're available in the common tongue. And they're available to all. Just to give you an idea of the impact of the printing press, I'll quote this statistic in law that is in William Lawhead's book. It took 45 copyists under Cosimo de' Medici 10 years to create, 2 years, 45 copyists, 2 years to create 200 books. The printing press, of course, was invented in 1447. By 1500, there were 1,000 printing presses in Europe and over 9 million books of 30,000 titles. 9 million books within 3 years in Europe. 1,000 presses going. All of a sudden, vast amounts of knowledge and information are available. But most important, what, of course, is the first book to come off the printing presses? Of course, it's the Bible. And the Bible is printed in the common tongue. So now, people have access to the Bible, and they can read the Bible, and they can decide what the Bible means for themselves. This is a whole new worldview that becomes available. And it is really the availability of the Bible in the common tongue which opens the way for the Protestant Reformation, or the Protestant breaking away from the Catholic Church. It starts in 1517, as I said, the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant churches are formed as many people break away from the Catholic Church. It all starts when Martin Luther, a monk in Germany, nails 95 theses to the doors of Wittenberg Castle. In these 95 theses, Martin Luther condemns the practices of the Catholic Church. He condemns indulgences, among other things. Now, it seems quite amazing that Martin Luther isn't immediately eliminated. You see, there had been others who had attempted to reform the church before. There had been others who had taken issue with the practices of the church hierarchy, but none of them survived. Or on occasion, they would actually be taken into the fold of the church and be able to enact some kind of reform. Francis of Assisi, now known as Saint Francis, was one of those. He tried to return the church to poverty and charity. He almost got eliminated. He almost got excommunicated. But eventually it was actually accepted and brought into the fold of the church and started a whole new order. But most of those who took exception to the church's practices were excommunicated, or they had the Inquisition visit and they were tortured and they died. Martin Luther survived, however. Well, times had changed and nations had changed. You see, as the church's corruption became more obvious, the nations and monarchies were becoming more powerful. Nationalism was beginning to rise, and there was this new invention that had come in during the Renaissance as well, another new invention, gunpowder. Gunpowder had changed the nature of warfare, and it changed the entire character of nations. And by 1517, there were members of the monarchy who were no longer too pleased at having to bow to the Pope, no longer very pleased that the Pope had authority over them. In fact, some of them believed that they should have authority over the Pope. Among those monarchs were the German princes, the princes of the German states. Martin Luther was in Germany, and he actually had the support of the German princes who wanted to break away from the Pope in Rome. Therefore, Martin Luther was able to create a whole new Christian church based on the Bible, based on this radical notion that individuals could read the Bible for themselves and through faith and a relationship with the divine, a personal relationship with the divine, determines God's will for them. This is quite different. Martin Luther is declaring that the church is unnecessary to intercede between human beings and God. That individuals for themselves can understand God's word, God's will, God's revelation. A whole new way of looking at religion and spirituality, breaking away from 1,000 years of tradition. And once Martin Luther and his followers broke away, others followed suit. Other Christian churches were formed. Others broke away from the church. Henry VIII broke England away from the church for his own very personal reasons. Henry VIII had been married to his brother's widow when he was 18, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was the daughter of Isabel and Ferdinand of Spain, the king and queen who had financed Christopher Columbus, if you know that story. So Catherine of Aragon was rather important, and the alliance between Spain and England was extremely important. And when Henry's brother died and Catherine was left a widow, Henry married Catherine. But after 20 years of marriage, Catherine had produced no son. Henry did not have an heir to the throne. It looked like the line of his monarchy would be over. Henry had found this particularly difficult to take because Henry had masses of illegitimate children. Henry slept around quite a bit, but he had no royal heir. Well, this situation was much worse when Henry fell in love. He fell in love with the daughter of a minor lord. Her name was Anne Boleyn. And Anne, unlike so many others, refused to go to bed with Henry unless he married her. Well, this made Henry absolutely crazy. He became obsessed. He wanted to marry Anne. The problem is he was married to Catherine. So he needed a divorce. He didn't need just a divorce. He needed the marriage annulled. So he asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine. And the Pope said no. Not surprising, the Pope had a political relationship with Spain that was very important. He wasn't about to make the daughter of the Spanish king and queen an unwed mother. Henry was furious, and therefore Henry broke from Rome. He declared that the English churches were no longer subject to Rome, and he created a whole new Protestant church, the Anglican Church, the Church of England. It wasn't just Henry and Martin Luther either. Then the Calvinists started. And before you knew it, there were churches breaking away from the Catholic Church all over Europe. Now, the Catholic Church attempted to reform itself, actually. This is called the CounterReformation. The Church begins to reform itself from within. The Church ended the selling of indulgences. The Church again became more pious. And in fact, the Church began to take that form, which is much more, would be more recognizable today. We might not recognize the Catholic Church of the Renaissance, but the Catholic Church of the Counter-Reformation would be much more familiar to us. However, it was too late. The Protestant churches remained separated from the Catholic Church. However, this was to have devastating consequences. The result of the separation of the Protestant churches and the Catholic Church was hundreds of years of bloody warfare between the two factions. Kings and queens would take different sides, declare different state religions. Sometimes your country would be Protestant one year, Catholic the next, then Protestant again. This happened indeed in England. Because, of course, if you know history, you know that Henry VIII did indeed marry Anne Boleyn, but she failed to give him a son as well. And so Henry then had to get rid of Anne. And he did. He had her head cut off. Anne had given Henry, as they would say then, a daughter. That daughter was Elizabeth. Elizabeth, of course, would grow up to be a Protestant. The marriage of Anne and Henry had been based on the creation of the Protestant church. But you remember, Catherine had a daughter, Mary. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon of Spain, was Catholic. Well, when Mary was on the throne, England was Catholic. When Elizabeth followed, England was Protestant. Allegiances to churches were often vicious and fanatic. State allegiances, and those, whoever were in power, seemed more than willing to slaughter members of the other faith. When the Protestants were in power, the Catholics were being slaughtered. When the Catholics were in power, the Protestants being slaughtered. And the people were slaughtering one another. This was an era began of massive religious persecutions. It was in part because of these religious persecutions that people began to leave Europe for that land that Columbus had discovered, for the Americas. People wanted to escape the burnings, the riots, the warfare. They wanted to be safe to practice their religion, whatever it might be, without the threat of death or burning. And so many of those people got on boats and came to America. And that is really how America was founded. That is why, when eventually a nation was created by those people who had left Europe, a fundamental precept of that nation is the separation of church and state. Because they realized what happens when the state tells you how to worship and whom to worship. And so we move through the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation. And now we can look at the next great movement in the West as we fly through history, really, just touching on some of the highlights. And the next great movement would be the scientific revolution. Towards the end of the Renaissance, by the late 1500s, early 1600s, the scientific method had been discovered. Now, the scientific method was a new approach to scientific inquiry on how to determine truths from facts. And because of the scientific method, science was making astounding new discoveries. Discoveries that worked, discoveries that changed lives, discoveries, actually, that would change our view of the world. I'm going to talk about just one of those discoveries that came with our next movement, the scientific revolution, which is really the late 1500s to now. The scientific revolution is still going on. Of course, one of the most famous discoveries of the scientific revolution happened at the very beginning, and that was Copernicus's discovery that the Earth moved about the sun, that the sun was the center of our universe and the Earth circled the sun. This may seem quite obvious to us today. However, at the time, it was mind-blowing. You see, everyone had believed that the Earth was the center of the universe and that everything, including the sun, revolved about the Earth. This is very psychologically important because it, of course, makes the Earth the center of creation, and human beings, being the ultimate creation on the Earth, makes human beings the apex of all creation, its central meaning, its central purpose. The ultimate purpose of creation, the final purpose of creation, is human beings moving to their final purpose and realization in God. But Copernicus says no. Copernicus says that the Earth is just one planet revolving around a sun, which is the center of the cosmos. Copernicus didn't publish this till after he died. But even then, it didn't take a great amount of note. There wasn't a huge reaction to Copernicus's publication. In fact, the biggest reaction came from Martin Luther. Because of course the Bible says, if you take it literally, that the earth stands still. Martin Luther was furious at Copernicus and said, "That fool! Would he turn the world upside down?" But the Catholic Church didn't take much note. It wasn't until later, to the early 17th century, when Galileo confirmed Copernicus's ideas by observations through his telescope, that the Church took note. Now, we cannot cover all the reasons that the Church at this point, when it had ignored basically Copernicus's findings, suddenly became furious at Galileo's contentions. But Galileo had looked through his telescope, this new invention, and through his observations had determined that yes, indeed, Copernicus is correct. The Earth moves about the sun. The Earth is just one of many planets moving about the sun, which is indeed the center of the universe. At this time, by this point, the Catholic Church was in the midst of the Counter-Reformation. Doctrine was becoming more and more important, and the Church's authority in interpreting doctrine was becoming more and more important. And in point of fact, the Church was less concerned with Galileo's observations than it was with the fact that Galileo presumed to interpret Scripture in light of those observations. But as I said, that in itself will be a book. It's an interesting book. There's many on this moment, worth reading. But the Catholic Church had Galileo arrested. And Galileo was forced to recant. He was forced to say that he was wrong. He got down on one knee and said, "I was wrong." He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Nevertheless, he had to promise never to publish again, nor to do no more scientific investigations on the planets. Galileo was an old man by then, and his house arrest was rather luxurious. He had many powerful friends, even in the Church. But nevertheless, famous moment in history, as Galileo said, he was wrong. Because of course we know now Galileo was indeed right. Newton and then Kepler and then Newton would prove, in fact, that Galileo was correct. And because of this, a whole new consciousness would have to evolve for human beings, because human beings were no longer the center of the cosmos, no longer its ultimate purpose, no longer the apex of creation. Human beings were just another creature on a tiny planet, third out from the sun, and soon they would come to realize in a universe which is just one of billions of universes. Quite a different worldview. Quite a new existential anxiety. Quite different questions now must be asked in some ways about the meaning of purpose of life, about what one should do, about what one should be, about what one should seek to accomplish, about ethics itself. And so, because of this development through the Antirationalism after Aquinas, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, ultimately the scientific revolution, eventually philosophy would be born once again, specifically to deal with these new existential questions. And eventually it became more and more obvious that philosophy was necessary to answer these existential questions. For many, religion no longer seemed a secure place to look for answers. Years of bloodshed and warfare and inquisitions and witch burnings had made religion itself suspect. But even those who still looked to religion often found they still needed philosophy. because there was no longer one religion. There was no longer one sure answer. There were many religions. And the individual had to choose between these many religions. And on top of that, in some of these religions, some of these Christian religions, the individual was expected to interpret the Bible for his or herself. No easy task. Sure, there were plenty of preachers willing to jump in and interpret it for you, but some people realized that it was their obligation, that they themselves had to read, that they themselves had to know. And so the development of the methods of philosophy to deal with these new existential questions and to find answers to the old existential questions seem more and more important. Religious warfare, bloody conflicts, the need to choose religions. Many people turn to science now. Science, in a sense, became the new religion. People look to science for answers more and more. But science is not adapted to answer questions of meaning and purpose. At least it has not yet been. It still is not. Science can tell you what you can do, but science can't necessarily tell you whether you ought to do it or not. And so, philosophy once again became important. People once again turned to the use of reason and observation to answer philosophical questions. It seemed to some even that science had worked so beautifully. Once there was a scientific method, science seemed to be coming up with sure answers, at least answers that worked. If we could find a philosophical method, we could find a method to find sure answers to philosophical questions, including ethics. And once again, people began to use reason. The 17th century, the 18th centuries, in fact, would be called the age of reason. And reason, in fact, became the central point of the creation of the nation of the United States of America. Because now, you see, the medieval worldview was gone forever. Now, not only did people have to answer individually their own questions about life, not only did they get to choose their own religion, but now people were expected to be involved in choosing the direction of an entire nation, at least some of those people. And they looked to reason to show them how to do that. Reason was at the basis of the founding of this nation. It was the basis of the creation of democracies. It was the basis of the separation of church and state and allowing the individual to decide. And out of that new interest in philosophy, there would come a need to develop, once again, ethical theories that would answer what is the good and how can we prove what is good without relying upon divine command. And as people looked to philosophy to answer existential questions, there came this realization that indeed a method was necessary to approach these questions. If one was going to try to figure out the great questions of life for themselves, what is the good? Why be good? What is the method to know the good? What is my meaning? What is my purpose? Why am I here? What is happiness? How is happiness achieved? Well, once again, we have to come to the question of epistemology. How are you going to answer these questions? What method are you going to use? And so, the rebirth of the philosophy in the 17th and 18th century once again begins to struggle to decide upon or discover a method for answering philosophical questions. This is something that we've talked about it again and again since our episode on the best possible answers. How does one arrive at the best possible answers? And the philosophers of the 17th and 18th century, in a way, reflected the dichotomy that we saw earlier between Plato and Aristotle. Plato had looked to logic applied to a priori ideas, which he saw as transcendental forms. Aristotle believed in a priori ideas, but he believed knowledge could be found through experience of this world. Well, two really epistemological movements would arise in the 17th and 18th century. The first of them would be very similar to Plato. These were the rationalists, and they believed that truth could be determined by applying logic to a priori ideas. The problem is, of course, as it always has been, how does one discover a priori ideas? How does one find ideas that are not based on experience? How does one find ideas which are universal and self-evidently true? As we saw before, in the creation of the United States of America, the founding fathers had said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these we hold to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it's one thing to declare a priori truths, to just say we believe these to be self-evident truths. It's another thing to prove a priori ideas. And so the rationalists set about proving the existence of a priori ideas, much as Socrates and Plato had 2,000 years ago. The thing is, of course, if you'll remember, Socrates and Plato had determined that a priori ideas exist because we had experienced them before we were born. Socrates and Plato believed in reincarnation. The philosophers of the 17th and 18th century did not. So where to look for a priori ideas? Well, one of the most famous of the rationalist philosophers is René Descartes, who published his famous Discourses on the Method in 1638. And by method, Descartes had decided upon a method to discover a priori ideas. You see, Descartes was a mathematician. Anyone who's taken high school algebra knows the Cartesian coordinates, x and y, that's Descartes. And as a mathematician, Descartes was well aware that in mathematics one could arrive at certain truths. He was also aware of the scientific method. The scientific method was arriving at least workable truths. So how can we find a philosophical method for certain truth? And Descartes thought to himself, and he thought, we want to find that which is undoubtable, which is utterly self-evident. I will discover self-evident truth by doubting everything that can be doubted. And then I will see what is undoubtable. I will see what remains. And so Descartes doubted everything. Doubted everything that could possibly be doubted. For instance, all of this, everything I see, everything I feel, can it be doubted? Yes. Why? Well, when I'm dreaming, I believe, for instance, that I am by a campfire, that I am drinking coffee, that I am talking. And I'm quite shocked when I wake up and I'm actually in bed. Doesn't that happen to you? You're sitting there and you're dreaming, and then you wake up shocked to find you're in bed because you're convinced that you were where you were dreaming. Well, Descartes proposes, well, how do you know you're not dreaming now? How do you know that all of this is not some kind of dream? You may say ridiculous, but is it doubtable? You see, Descartes decided to throw out anything that could be doubted just a little bit because he wanted to find what was absolutely undoubtable. It's doubtable that this exists, so we have to throw it out. In fact, Descartes went so far as to say that it is possible that I have been put to sleep by some evil genius who tricks me into thinking that I am awake. Sound familiar? Yes. Descartes' notion of the evil genius is what is behind, in a sense, the movie The Matrix. In The Matrix, everyone has been put to sleep by an evil genius. It's just the Matrix is modern and those geniuses are machines. But this is fundamentally Descartes' notion. We do not know that we are not asleep and put to sleep by an evil genius. And in fact, Descartes is not the first to propose this. The Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali in the High Middle Ages had written basically the same thing. I do not know that I have not been put to sleep by an evil genius. And actually there were early Christian communities that believed they had been put to sleep by an evil genius, that this world in fact was created by an evil genius. So Descartes doubted everything and then found the one thing that was undoubtable, that he was doubting. Seems obvious, doesn't it? But Descartes came up with the extraordinary idea, I am thinking, therefore I exist. And that is Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Existence and thought are the beginning of the a priori ideas. And with Descartes, we really have the birth of modern philosophy, which will lead eventually to our next great ethical theory, which we will talk about in our next show, Immanuel Kant. In the meantime, read your web chapters, do your homework, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.